Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening devoted to the subject of Nazi German broadcast to the Middle East during World War II. Over the course of the last few years, the Vidal Sassoon Center has initiated a number of evenings and discussions to the question of radical Islam and anti-Semitism. This time we're taking a slightly different perspective and exploring a subject that hitherto has not been covered, neither by ourselves nor, to the best of my knowledge, in the Academy to any significant degree. With the exceptions of a handful of researchers. So I think that we're particularly fortunate tonight to have a guest who in a moment I will present to you his CV in a shortened form, who is uniquely equipped in many ways to deal with this topic. If we ask ourselves, how is it that in the Middle East today, in the Arab world, in the larger Muslim world, anti-Semitism has taken root so deeply and has become such an acute problem? If we ask, how come that such a dehumanized image of the Jews and the state of Israel has come about, then surely one of the keys to understanding that is what took place in the 1930s and even more during World War II as a direct consequence of efforts by the Nazi regime to influence the Arab world. And yet, remarkably little attention has been paid in concrete terms to that, and particularly to the means of communication which was the most effective in reaching a mass audience, namely the broadcasts from Berlin. And therefore, the subject which will be discussed tonight by Professor Jeffrey Herf is one which has not only its intrinsic historical significance and importance as part of the history of the Holocaust and of the Second World War, but it has implications for today. Indeed, if we were only to think, for instance, of the current situation in Iraq, with all the difficulties of the American intervention there and the anti-American, anti-Western feeling, and so on, inevitably we can cast our minds back to 1941, for example, or even before, to the 1930s, and see that there was an extremely intense anti-Western, particularly anti-British at that time, as well as anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist propaganda. And much of that was stimulated and fueled by German Nazism, although it had its own indigenous sources, and nothing, I'm sure, that will be said tonight in any way is intended to detract from the fact that the anti-Semitism existing in the Arab and Islamic world does have its own sources. But we need to understand better what were the influences that came from the outside, and particularly during this formative period, which I think in retrospect we can see now as being even more important than it might have seemed some time ago. Particularly when we think of such features of Nazi anti-Semitism as the emphasis on a global struggle with Jewry, seeing the war against Zionism in that larger anti-Semitic context, one can understand how much this could appeal to the Arab world already engaged in a bitter conflict over Palestine in the 1930s, the Arab Revolt in Palestine, which provided an important pretext and an opportunity for spreading anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish propaganda, but also in other parts of the Arab world. I mentioned Iraq, but there were other countries, Egypt and the whole movement towards anti-colonialism. So when we ask about the particularly dangerous, I would even say genocidal or potentially genocidal forms of anti-Semitism that we see today, it's very important for us to look back to the historic connections, some of the missing links, which I think tonight we will receive an answer to. And in terms of the debate, the ongoing debate about what the sources of Muslim anti-Semitism are today, we need to know that the Nazi propaganda was very widespread. Indeed, it wasn't confined when it came to Muslims to the Middle East. For example, even in the campaigns in the Soviet Union. I myself was surprised to discover fairly recently just how much anti-Jewish propaganda had been directed at the liberation, as the Germans called it, of the peoples of the Caucasus. In other words, there was an extensive anti-Jewish campaign directed against Jewish Bolshevik domination, among other things. And as we know, also in the Balkans, in Bosnia, where Hajj Amin al-Husseini was active, as well as in the Middle East. So there are global ramifications and a global reach to the Nazi propaganda of that time. And it was remarkably popular. Probably it's difficult to imagine today, but I've heard this from a number of people who still remember that period, and they always mention the fact that these broadcasts from Berlin were eagerly awaited, that they were widely heard in public places, in cafes, and places of amusement, and also in people's homes. So there is no doubt that there was an impact, and yet we know so little about it. And one of the reasons that we've asked Professor Jeffrey Herf to speak tonight, it's by no means the only reason, is because this will fill a major gap, perhaps even a kind of black hole in our overall picture of the interaction between two very different strands, and yet they are interconnected. European anti-Semitism, particularly in its ultimately most extreme form, German Nazism, and Muslim Arab anti-Semitism. I've known Jeffrey Herf really for quite a while now. I wouldn't hazard a guess exactly where it was that we first met, but I initially came to know him through a very important book that he published quite some time back, maybe 20 years ago or more, on reactionary modernism, technology, culture, and politics in Weimar and the Third Reich. It's still a book that I warmly recommend to all my students who want to understand something of the cultural and intellectual background, not only to Nazi Germany, but to German culture in the first half of the 20th century, and to the history of ideas in modern Europe. And I think that Jeffrey is really, in that field, one of the really outstanding, foremost cultural historians, somewhat in the mold of George Mosse, perhaps even better. And I would like to particularly single out a book which many of you, I would assume, would know, The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2006, and which also won an award and was, I think, not the only book by Jeffrey that I would mention here, that an earlier work, Divided Memory, The Nazi Past in the Two Germanys, received the National Jewish Book Award in 2006. Jeffrey is professor of history at the University of Maryland. He has edited a long list of works and published many, many articles, which I won't read out here, but what I would say is that not only is it a great pleasure and privilege to have him speak to us, but I'm eagerly looking forward to the eventual results of this research, which I think will help us to understand many things which at the present time remain somewhat obscure and relate to ongoing debates and cast a new light on them. So I understand Jeffrey will also have some slides at some point, and I invite you to proceed.
Well, thank you, Robert, for that very generous introduction. It's a great honor for me to speak here at the Vidal Sassoon Center at Hebrew University, where there are such very distinguished historians of modern European, Jewish, and German history, and have made decisive contributions to our understanding of Nazism and the Holocaust. I want to spend about 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about the argument that I made in the book The Jewish Enemy, and then I'll turn to my work in progress, which deals with Nazi Germany's propaganda aimed at the Middle East. Robert Wistrich, as many of you know, wrote a book called The Longest Hatred. And historians of the Holocaust and its ideological prehistory have devoted a great deal of effort to documenting the traditions of Jew hatred in German-speaking Europe and in Europe generally in the several centuries before the Nazis came to power. But a historian's question is always, why does something happen at a particular time and place and not earlier or later and not somewhere else? So the search for origins takes us towards the final solution, in George Mosse's words, but it doesn't take us to the final solution. And the question remains of why the longest hatred, which had led to periodic and repeated eras of persecution, should for the first time in its long European history have led to genocide. The historian's question is thus, what changed between 1939 and 1941 in the nature of anti-Semitism in Germany that led to such a radically different outcome? Now, in order to answer that question, I did two things, and my historians colleagues do them all the time. First, I looked at some archival material. And second, I looked at famous texts that everybody thinks that they understand very well. Speeches by Hitler, speeches by Joseph Goebbels, very famous articles that everybody knows and everybody is familiar with. And sometimes we historians make most progress when we look at what everybody thinks they know in a fresh way. And that's what I did. It was not a pleasant experience to read so many of these horrendous documents, but I came up with what I thought was a plausible argument as to why these things happened when and where they did. Because when the Nazis broadcast propaganda in Arabic and Persian and Turkish to the Middle East, what they were doing was taking a narrative that they had developed in Europe, a story about the way the world works, and presenting it in a different context. So what the Jewish enemy does is take a set of ideas and asks, how do the ideas become a narrative, a story? And as a historian of ideas and politics, I've long thought that the way that ideas really influence people in their minds and in their hearts is when the ideology is translated into a narrative. So the Nazi narrative, its radical anti-Semitic narrative, was a framework of understanding through which the Nazi leadership misunderstood ongoing events. Radical anti-Semitism was not only a set of prejudices, but it was a narrative rooted in a paranoid fantasy of an international Jewish conspiracy, and that this international conspiracy was the key to contemporary history. Contemporary history was not driven by the class struggle or the rule of ideas. It was driven by an international conspiracy. And the world is complicated, and it was a very confusing place in the 1930s and 1940s. The world is always a confusing place. And one of the things that radical anti-Semitism in Europe did for the Nazis was that it offered them a set of explanations as to why some very strange things happened. You recall that Winston Churchill referred to the alliance between the Soviet Union on the one hand and Britain and the United States on the other as an unnatural alliance. And it was bizarre that the communists were in alliance with the liberal democracies and capitalist societies. So why did this happen? Why did this alliance between the communists and the bourgeois countries emerge? And why did it persist? Well, the Nazis felt that this made perfect sense from the perspective of their anti-Semitic narrative. The anti-Hitler coalition, along with the entry of the United States into the war, were the two most powerful individual pieces of evidence that confirmed in their mind that the true driving force of the anti-Hitler coalition in the Second World War was a political actor named International Jewry. Now, key to the radicalization of anti-Semitism between 1939 and 1941 was the nature of this ideology as an overwhelmingly political accusation. Many of you know many books written about anti-Semitism rightly discuss the dimensions of this worldview that focus on the pejorative or alleged pejorative biological features of the Jews. Now, biological racism was important, and the stereotypical view of the Jew's body played an important role in exacerbating contempt and disdain and hatred. But racial biology, this is an important aspect of the argument, was not a central justification for mass murder. Now, I'll repeat that. Racial biology was not an important justification for mass murder. The distinctively genocidal components of radical anti-Semitism as derived from beliefs about the political actor International Jewry. That is, it was about what the Jews were alleged to have done, not their noses or their ears or their curly hair or their overweight or their lack of thereof. It is what they were alleged to have done, not the way they looked, that was so lethal. Because and so when the Nazis spoke about a war against the Jews, in Lucy Davidowitz's famous phrase, they were not only referring to the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe, they were referring to the war that they were waging against the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, because in their view, the war against Germany had been launched by International Jewry, and it was not an ordinary war that these Jews had launched against them. The purpose of this war was not to defeat the Nazi Party or the Wehrmacht, it was to exterminate the German people. And so, in response to this war that Jewry had launched, the Nazi regime was heroically engaged in an act of national self-defense and retaliation and in an effort to save the Germans from this horrendous fate. So one of the things that has happened that has been so important in the historical profession in the last 15 years is that the work of Yehuda Bauer here, but also Gerhard Weinberg, Richard Breitman, Christopher Browning, Shlomo Aronson, and others have drawn our attention to the inseparable connections between the Second World War and the Holocaust. In American universities, many students today know more about Auschwitz and the Wannsee Conference than they do about the Battle of the Atlantic or the Battle of Midway or the Eastern Front battles. That is, they know more about the final solution than they do about the war. And we're in a period of integration where, in order to understand the Holocaust, my colleagues have reminded us we need to understand its connection to the war, and the connection to the war in the minds of the Nazi leadership. Now, another aspect of the argument, which becomes clear when you read the public statements of the Nazi leaders, Hitler and his associates, was that they were, of course, as you all know, masters of euphemism and indirection. The famous term final solution is the most famous of these euphemisms. But when you read them, what is striking is how blunt and how clear, not secret or euphemistic, they were about their intention to exterminate and annihilate the Jewish race in Europe, to use Hitler's terms. The public language of the Nazi regime was quite frank. The problem of that period, and Hannah Arendt, who I know in Jerusalem is not the most popular figure sometimes, but she was right about some things. And one of the things that she was right about was that when the Nazis spoke about exterminating and annihilating the Jews, this was not, quote, mere propaganda. They meant what they said. The smart money of the 1940s, including some leading figures in the American intelligence services, said the Nazis say that they're going to do that, but they don't really mean it. They have other intentions in mind. But her understanding of totalitarian ideology was correct. Now, I won't belabor this point because you're quite familiar with Hitler's famous prophecy of January 30th of 1939. If the Jews were to again start a war in Europe, it would not end with the extermination of the Aryan race in Europe, but instead with the extermination of the Jews. On November 16th of 1941, Joseph Goebbels gave a radio address called "The Jews Are Guilty," in which he said the Jews, on the radio, the Jews are now suffering a gradual process of extermination which they had intended for us. Now, I'd like to show you a few images. Yeah, I want to show you a few images that convey the basic narrative, so that we all understand. So that you all understand what this narrative was about. These posters were distributed throughout throughout Germany. About 125,000 copies of each of these posters were distributed around the country. And this says the Jewish conspiracy against Europe, and you see a Soviet commissar, and a stereotypical British figure shaking hands over Europe. And then above it is a disembodied Jewish head who is supposedly running the show. This is a poster of December 10th of 1941, and any conspiracy theory is very detailed. And this poster, which was it has a great deal of detail about the Jewish conspiracy that is conducted by two leading figures, Bernard Baruch, an American financier, and Moses Zone, which is a pejorative or sarcastic way of referring to Lazar Kaganovich. And then here you see the Jewish wire pullers, and that's the people around that's the people such as Fiorello LaGuardia or Henry Morgenthau and Felix Frankfurter, various public figures in American life, Jews. And then Die Handlanger, the Stooges, Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin. This is a very important poster which was distributed in late November, early December of 1942. When Hitler spoke on the 30th of September of 1942, he repeated his murderous prophecy about what he would do to the Jews if they had started another war in Europe. And he then, in this iteration of the threat, says that when he made his first threat, the Jews were laughing. And then he says here, I don't know if the Jews are laughing today or if they have stopped laughing. But I can promise only one thing, that they will stop laughing everywhere. I had a very interesting conversation with Yehuda Bauer yesterday in which he pointed out to me, and on the top it says the laughter will go away. And then here you see President Roosevelt and Felix Frankfurter and Bernard Baruch, the Jews around Roosevelt. And so the Jews are the driving force here. And what Professor Bauer reminded me of was that Hitler, in a number of his comments, had referred to the extension of the attempt to murder the Jews beyond Europe. And so this is the significance here. They will stop laughing everywhere. That is not only in Europe, but everywhere. And we'll come back to that. This is one of the most striking anti-Semitic images of Nazi propaganda in Europe during the Second World War. It's a brilliant synthesis of the core message of Nazi propaganda. This is as dangerous a propaganda poster as one can imagine, because it says, hinted in Feindmächten der Jude, behind the enemy powers is the Jew. And so the stereotypical figure of the overweight Jewish man in the midst of the Second World War, when millions of young men are fit and trim and in uniform with a gold Star of David, what is he doing? He is lurking behind the flags of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. He is the power behind the scenes. He himself does not subject himself to the dangers of combat, but directs the war from behind the scenes. And so the point about the dangerous aspect of the association of the Jews as the driving force of the anti-Hitler coalition was that whenever a bomb landed on an apartment building in Berlin, or a mother and father got a notice that their son had been killed on the Eastern Front, as a result of the military action by the United States or Britain or the Soviet Union, every family in Germany thus had an existential reason, if they believed the propaganda of the government, to hate the Jews ever more. Because the propaganda was telling them the reason that your son is dead, or that your husband has died, or that your apartment building has been destroyed. The reason all of this is happening is not because of the secular powers, the communists and the British and the Americans, of course that's true, but the power behind it all is the Jews. And that's one reason why the hatred of the Jews intensified as the war continued. The hatred that was the result of the actions that the Allies were taking as they attempted to destroy the Nazi war machine was then deflected onto the Jews. So sometimes people have difficulty understanding why were those people so furious at the Jews during the death marches in the spring of 1945, when it was utterly pointless to make these people suffer so, when the war was so clearly lost. But one explanation would be that by then that as the war continued, the hatred of the Jews among the German population intensified. Now, let me turn now to the extension of this narrative, to the Arab world. The Nazis had a problem in appealing to Arabs. And the problem was Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Those of you who've had the pleasure of reading the book know that Hitler was a racist. You're learning something tonight, see? And that he was very disdainful and contemptuous of Egyptians and Arabs, and thought that they were militarily incompetent, and they lacked courage, and they were not manly, and that they would never succeed in fighting against the English. And anybody who thought that they could rely on the Arabs for anything was a complete fool. And it's full of a kind of European conventional disdain for Arabs. Well, one way of dealing with it was to translate Mein Kampf in abridged editions and leave out the offending passages, which the German government did. But a problem arose in 1936. The Nuremberg race laws had been passed, and they had made a very bad impression in the Middle East. And in particular, they had made a very bad impression on the captain of Egypt's Olympic sports team. And he drew the conclusion that if you're going to discriminate against non-Aryans, then I think it might not be such a good idea for Egypt to come to Berlin for the Olympic Games. We should boycott the Olympic Games because we don't want to attend games where people think that we're inferior. Well, the Foreign Office, the Propaganda Ministry, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, Hitler's Chancellery conducted a number of high-level meetings with the intention of convincing the Arabs that they had misunderstood the Nuremberg race laws. That the Nuremberg race laws were not making a distinction between Aryans and non-Aryans. They made a distinction between Germans and Jews. And because the Egyptians were not Jewish, and neither were the Iraqis or the Iranians or the Saudis or any of the Arab Semites, that they were all welcome in Berlin and that they should all come to the Olympic Games. And these meetings of 1936 were very important as a precondition in which the Nazi officials had to think through what Nazi racism meant, what anti-Semitism meant. And one of the implications was that from then on, the propaganda should never refer to German policy as anti-Semitic. The newspaper editors and radio broadcasters were told never to refer to Nazi policy as an anti-Semitic policy. Rather, we are Judengegner. It was an anti-Jewish policy. And this ideological sleight of hand was very important as the Nazis began to plan their propaganda aimed at the Arab world. The propaganda was, as Robert pointed out, came over shortwave radio from Berlin and Rome and Bari. But it was designed in the German Foreign Ministry, not the Propaganda Ministry. The Propaganda Ministry had some involvement, but Joachim von Ribbentrop won a bureaucratic battle with Joseph Goebbels, and the core of the propaganda was designed in the Foreign Office. By the end of 1940, about 500 people were working in the offices of Germany's radio that was aimed abroad. By 1943, the Nazi regime was broadcasting 16 different stations in 13 different languages every day. Prominent exile pro-Nazi politicians such as Subhas Chandra Bose from India, Rashid Ali al-Kilani from Iraq, and Haj Amin al-Husseini spoke frequently on these stations. Within the German Foreign Office, Division 7, the Orient Office, oversaw propaganda and political strategy towards the Middle East, including Egypt, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, India, Iran, Sudan, and Ceylon. The Office of Political Radio, the Rundfunk Politische Abteilung, existed within the Foreign Office political offices. By September of 1943, it had 226 employees, including its director, Kurt Kiesinger, who was subsequently the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany between 1966 and 1969, when Beate Klarsfeld gave him a well-deserved slap on the cheek. The staff of Division 7 wrote and discussed German texts for broadcast primarily in Arabic, but also in Persian or Hindi, intended for audiences in North Africa, the Arab world from Egypt to Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and India. It met regularly with the Foreign Office Arab Committee that included experts on the region and officials who were responsible for contact with the prominent exiles, such as Husseini and Kilani. The Orient Division was larger than the offices broadcasting to Western Europe, England, Ireland, Spain, Southeast Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and the United States. The director of Division 7 during the war was Kurt Munzel, a diplomat who had worked in the Dresdner Bank in Cairo in the decade before the war. By 1942, he had a staff of 19 people. It included, judging from the names, 7 native Arabic speakers and 4 scholarly assistants, that is, Germans with a knowledge of Arabic and Islam. Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and Rashid al-Kilani, the leader of a pro-Nazi coup in Baghdad that collapsed in spring of 41 in the face of Britain's armed intervention, arrived in Berlin in the fall of 1941 with an entourage. From September of 1939 to the fall of 1941, before their arrival, the Arabic broadcast drew on the expertise of German Orientalists and their knowledge regarding Arabic and Islamic literature and poetry, the local knowledge gained by German diplomats in the pre-war years, and pro-Axis Arabs living in Berlin when the war began. Most of these, what I'll call Munzel broadcasts, had the tone of a sympathetic, well-informed, politically engaged professor, one eager to please, yet not quite able to pick up on the ins and outs and crucial details of local politics and slang. The early broadcasts did send a clear message that the Nazi regime, rather than celebrate the superiority of Aryans over inferior Middle Eastern Semites, was a friend to both Arab nationalists and Muslim fundamentalists. And I'll give you a few examples. On December 3rd of 1940, Munzel's Orient office broadcast a paper about the English occupation of Egypt. With the incantation, "O Mohammedaner," O Muslims, the broadcast then made a direct appeal to Muslims and not only to Arab nationalists who opposed British rule in Egypt. It did so in the repetitive incantations of a religious sermon that evoked the authority of the Holy Quran, let's quote, and past days of piety. And I'll quote now from the broadcast. O God's servants, this is in Arabic from Berlin. O God's servants, above all of the other commandments, none is more important to the Muslims than piety, for piety is the core of all virtues and the bond of all honorable human characteristics. Muslims, you are now backward because you have not shown God the proper piety, and you do not fear him. You do things that are not commanded, and you leave to the side things that are. God's word has proven to be true, and yet you are now humiliated. You are now the humiliated ones in your own country. This has come about, your humiliation, because you don't have the piety and fear of God as your pious forefathers did. Of them one can say, they are strong against the unbelievers and merciful against themselves, is a quote from the Quran, as you know. O Muslims, direct your gaze to the Holy Quran and the tradition of the prophets. Then you will see that Islamic law is driven by piety toward God and fear of his punishment. O Muslims, I call you to piety towards God, because it is an inexhaustible source and a sharp weapon. It offers the good and it prevents evil. In short, it is Islam. That is, it is surrender to God. O Muslims, you've seen how God placed piety at the top of all commandments, and how God has rewarded the pious with victory and success, how he helps them in every situation. There was a great deal of debate within the foreign ministry in Berlin about whether or not to make and how much to make explicit appeals to Islam. Some officials preferred to appeal to secular nationalists. Yet the broadcasts and the inner office memos indicated that during the course of the war, the Nazi hardliners, those around, for example, Himmler in the SS, and also in the Foreign Office, the propaganda ministry, as well as Hitler himself, saw an elective affinity between Nazi ideology and policy, and that of a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. Nazi broadcasts repeated that the values of Islam, such as piety, obedience, community, unity rather than skepticism, collectivism rather than individualism and division, were similar to those of Nazi Germany. That such a melange of a mix of assaults on modern political values was conveyed via the most modern means of electronic communication in 1940 and 41 was another example of what I previously called the reactionary modernist dimensions of Nazi ideology and policy. This and other broadcasts conveyed the message that a revival of fundamentalist Islam was a parallel project to the revolt against Western political modernity, that it was being carried out by the Nazi regime. The message of this and other broadcasts was that a return to a literal reading of the Quran, or rather a continuation of a literal reading of the Quran, and its application to contemporary events was not only or primarily a relic of a backward and pre-industrial culture, but it was a message that was coming from the great movement now in power in the most advanced and powerful country in Europe, that is Nazi Germany. Nazi propaganda also postulated a positive and welcome affinity between National Socialism and Islam regarding the idea of community. On December 12th of 1940, German radio from Berlin stressed that Islam is a religion of the community and not one of the individual. It is a religion of the common welfare, the German term is Gemeinnutz, and not of self-interest, Eigennutz. Islam is therefore a just and true nationalism, for it calls on Muslims to place the general interests ahead of private interests, to live not for oneself but for religion and fatherland. This is the most important goal that Islam follows. It is the basis of its prayers and commandments. Of course, as those of you who are familiar with Nazi ideology know, the priority of the common welfare over self-interest was a continuing and key theme of National Socialism before 1933 and in the regime afterwards. These specifically religious broadcasts would hopefully establish a willingness, a connection among devout Muslim audiences that would encourage them or open them up to hearing Nazism's specifically secular political messages. On the same day that Radio Berlin broadcast the above message, it sent out a government statement for the Arabs. From the same station, in the same hour, perhaps with the same announcer, it moved from the specifically religious to the secular. Listeners heard that Germany expressed full sympathy for the Arabs' struggle for freedom and independence, so they could take their proper place under the sun and recover the glory and honor and service of humanity and civilization. The Germans expressed their love and sympathy for the Arabs, and this had found a strong echo at home among the Germans. This connection was not surprising because Germans and Arabs shared many qualities and virtues, such as courage in war, heroism, and manly character. They both also, by the way, shared in the suffering and injustices at the end of the First World War. Both of these great peoples, I'm quoting now, had their honor insulted, their rights were denied and trampled underfoot. Obviously, they had in mind their interpretation of the Versailles Treaty. Both bled from the same wounds, and both also had the same enemy, namely the Allies who divided them and allowed them to no claim to honor. Now Germany has succeeded to get out from under this disgrace and to regain all of its old rights so that the German voice is now heard everywhere and has again taken its old place. Germany, in other words, Nazi Germany, was a model for the Arabs to follow. Germany had been humiliated. Germany had been divided. Germany had been mistreated and lied to by the Allies in Versailles, just as the Arabs had been humiliated and divided and lied to by the British, supposedly, at the end of the First World War. And so Germany's return to unity and strength was a model for the Arabs to follow. Now, these early broadcasts, as effective as they may have been, lacked a certain political punch and grasp of local idioms and politics. That changed in November of 1941, when the pro-Nazi Arab exiles, Husseini, Kilani et al., arrived in Berlin. As many of you know, and as is well known, they both met Hitler and Ribbentrop. They and their associates worked closely with officials in the Nazi Foreign Ministry in its Arab and Orient committees in the Office of Political Radio, to which I referred earlier. Gerhard Weinberg pointed out to me, actually he didn't point out to me, he's published this, but he also mentioned it in conversation. Japan, it's good to have allies. Allies are a good thing to have in a dangerous world. And Japan gave Germany something it didn't have, a large surface naval fleet with aircraft carriers and able to attack the United States Navy. Husseini and Kilani and the Arabic language radio writers and speakers accompanying them gave the Nazi regime something it had not had before either. It gave them an asset it had not had before in its propaganda and political wars, a very important asset, namely native Arabic speakers who could communicate Nazism's messages in colloquial, fluent, passionate Arabic. Berlin in Arabic and the Voice of Free Arabism broadcast news and commentary several times a day for the entire period of the war. What went over the air in Arabic had to be written previously in German. None of the Arabic language announcers were independent actors or freelancers. The German archives, however, contain only a small fraction of the texts of the wartime broadcasts. Some were destroyed by the Air Force of Britain and the United States as they bombed the foreign ministry buildings. Some were destroyed by German officials themselves. Some were lost simply in the chaos of a lost war. But the texts of the Arabic language broadcasts from Berlin have survived someplace else. They survived because of the efforts of a remarkable diplomat named Alexander Kirk. Alexander Kirk was the charge d'affaires in the United States Embassy in Berlin in 1939 and 1940, and he wrote some remarkable memos back to Washington about the persecution of Jews, very important memos about the persecution of German Jews. He then took up a position as the ambassador to Egypt in 1941, and he arrived in Cairo with a deep knowledge of the Nazi regime and a hatred of the regime and a determination to want to win the Second World War and defeat it. And one of his ways of helping to win the war was to buy tape recorders, hire his own native Arabic speakers in Egypt, tape record Nazi Germany's Arabic broadcasts, transcribe it, translate the broadcasts into English, and send them back to the Office of Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, every week from 1941 until the end of the war. Between 15 and 30 pages of verbatim English translations that were sitting in the United States National Archives a mile from my office at the University of Maryland for the last 60 years, gathering dust, and as far as I know, nobody had been paying much attention to them until I found them or came across them last summer. Kirk first summarized some of the broadcasts, and then he concluded that summaries were not enough. But here is one summary that is fairly detailed, that he sent back to Washington on April 18th of 1942. And I read it because it's a summary of the themes of German broadcasts of the preceding 6 months. So it isn't just about a short period of time. This is Kirk. German propaganda broadcasts in Arabic attempt to convince the Arabs of the following. The Axis countries have a natural sympathy with the Arabs and their great civilization, the only one comparable with the civilization introduced by the New Order in Europe, which is now being suppressed by British imperialism, Bolshevik barbarity, Jewish greed, and more recently, American materialism. So great has Arab indignation grown over Arab sufferings that it has lately been hinted that one of the main German war aims is to release Arab countries from the oppressive grip of Anglo-Bolshevik imperialism. The Arabs could never be friends of Britain because her promises are false, and she has destroyed Arab unity and murdered Arab patriots. She has handed Palestine over to the Jews and loosed the communists over Iran and Iraq. The British used honeyed words when they seek Arab aid, but the Arabs remember the generous promises made by Britain in the last war. Throughout the entire Second World War, Nazi radio from Berlin repeated a coupling again and again and again. Britain and the Jews, Britain and the Jews, Britain and the Jews. And then the United States and the Jews, or the Soviet Union and the Jews. But in view of the tensions between the Yishuv and the British, it's interesting to be reminded that in Nazi propaganda, Britain was completely associated with the Jews because Britain was fighting against the Nazi regime. And why should Britain fight against the Nazi regime? What sense did that make? The explanation goes back to the original narrative that I mentioned at the outset. Kirk summarized themes about the Jews, which he said were voiced, quote, ad nauseum on Nazi radio in the preceding 6 months as follows. The Jews, backed by Britain and the U.S., are the arch enemies of Islam. They control American finance, and they forced Roosevelt to pursue a policy of aggression. Roosevelt, the warmonger, and Churchill, the gravedigger of the British Empire, though criminal in themselves, are playthings in the hands of the Jewish fiends who are destroying civilization. It's known the White House is full of Jews, and the most eminent figures among the Allies in the Near East are Jews. The Jews are typified by Chaim Weizmann, aspirant to the throne of Palestine, who is determined that Palestine, Syria, and Transjordan will be united as a pure Jewish center that will control the whole of the Middle East and eventually the world. The Nazis, by the way, never supported Zionism. Never supported Zionism. They, of course, as you know, signed the Havarah Agreement, and they made it possible for some German Jews to come to Palestine. But they always viewed Zionism as part of an international Jewish conspiracy, which they called a Jewish Vatican in Palestine. Weizmann is backed by America and Britain. The Arabs who have lost their lands and wealth to the rapacious Jewish settlers in Palestine and their liberty to the British will now be deported to suffer famine and discomfort. Throughout the war, Nazi radio propaganda linked Britain and the United States in particular to support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Every statement by any public figure in Britain or the United States, however important or unimportant, whether part of the United States government or a private organization, any statement expressing anger over the persecution of the Jews of Europe or support for a Jewish state in Palestine was taken in Nazi propaganda as to be further proof that the Jews were in control of the government of the United States of America. Now, the forthcoming book that I'm writing on this will include many documents. Today, just a few must suffice. Here, for example, is a broadcast of 7:30 p.m., April 10th of 1942, from Germany in Arabic, entitled "The British, the Jews, and the Communists are the common enemies of the Arabs." Quote, Britain has shown her enmity to the Arabs. The British committed one of the worst crimes against the Arabs by bringing the Jews to their country and giving them every support, holding them superior to the Arabs, and manifesting their sympathy toward the establishment of a Jewish kingdom in the Arab countries. This was done by the British and the Jews because of their lack of insight, but they will shortly learn how sadly they were mistaken. The Zionist world movement depends on Britain in order that this movement may realize its oppressive hopes, and the Jews have plotted with Britain to strangle Islam. Not only that, but the Jewish movement also enjoys great support from the USA, and the Jews there have supreme influence. You will note, as you already have noted, I'm sure, the importance of repetition. And we're not dealing with very complicated ideas here, but repetition was very important. All of these themes were present in German propaganda directed at German and European audiences. In the Arabic language broadcast, the Allies' alleged support for the Zionist project became a key additional theme. And this alleged support confirmed the truth of the general analysis in their eyes that an international Jewish conspiracy was the driving force of the Allied coalition. They said again and again, a victory for the Allies is a victory for the Jews, and a defeat for the Allies is a victory a victory for the Axis is a victory for the Arabs. Now, This propaganda was part of attempting to win a war. In 1942, as General Erwin Rommel's North Africa Corps advanced to within 60 miles of Alexandria, Egypt, German propaganda reached a crescendo. On July 3rd of 42, Berlin and Arabic announced that it had very important announcements, that the Axis forces were entering Egypt to dismiss the British from Egyptian territory and liberate the whole of the Near East from the British yoke. This anti-imperialist dimension of Nazi propaganda was also a repeated component of the radio broadcast, that Germany, even more than Italy, was an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial power arriving in the Middle East in order to liberate the Arabs from British and French imperialism, especially British imperialism. Here is the Mufti on the radio that day. The glorious victory secured by the Axis troops in North Africa has encouraged the Arabs and the whole East and filled their hearts with admiration for Marshal Rommel's genius and the bravery of the Axis soldiers. This is because the Arabs believe that the Axis powers are fighting against the common enemy, namely Britain and the Jews, and in order to remove the danger of communism spreading following the Allied aggression on Iran. These victories, generally speaking, will have a far-reaching repercussion on Egypt, because the loss of the Nile Valley and of the Suez Canal and the collapse of British mastery over the Mediterranean and the Red Sea will bring nearer the defeat of Britain and the end of the British Empire. The German and Italian declaration regarding the independence of the Arab countries was one that Husseini and Kilani had been seeking from Hitler ever since they arrived, Hitler and Mussolini, ever since they arrived in Rome and Berlin, and expressed their support for the Axis powers. Given that neither Vichy France nor Fascist Italy had gone to war in order to guarantee independence and sovereignty to the Arabs, Hitler and Mussolini had postponed making any such statement. Now that an uprising in Egypt might undermine the British armed forces faced with Rommel's Africa Corps, the dictators agreed to do so. Now, I don't have time to go into some very important memos that Alexander Kirk sent to Secretary of State Hull in the spring of 1942, except to say that Kirk argued that in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, much attention in Washington was devoted to that part of the world, and the Middle East, the strategic significance of the Middle East was underappreciated in the State Department and the Pentagon. And so then he laid out a whole set of reasons, not only oil, but also the centrality of the Middle East for a successful attack on Europe and the Balkans, and that it would not be possible to defeat the Nazi regime in Europe if the war was lost in North Africa. And he got Roosevelt's attention, and Roosevelt did send more equipment and armed forces to help the British, who needed the help very badly. Now, the diet of anti-Semitism was pervasive. As they had in Europe, the broadcast claimed that the war was a Jewish war and that Allied victory would mean Jewish domination of the Middle East. At 8:15 p.m., Cairo time, on July 7th of 1942, the Voice of Free Arabism broadcast was recorded by American officials and is one of the most remarkable Nazi broadcasts of the war in the Middle East. And it illustrated the links between the general propaganda in Europe and its adaptation to the Middle Eastern context. The text is entitled, "Kill the Jews Before They Kill You." It was a statement that equaled that of Hitler and Goebbels in its anti-Semitic radicalism. The broadcast began with a lie, namely that a large number of Jews residing in Egypt and a number of Poles, Greeks, Armenians, and Free French who had fled from Europe to Cairo had been issued with revolvers and ammunition by the British in order to help them against the Egyptians at the last moment when Britain is forced to evacuate Egypt, unquote. So the broadcast continued as follows. In the face of this barbaric procedure by the British, we think it best, if the life of the Egyptian nation is to be saved, that the Egyptians rise up as one man to kill the Jews before they have a chance of betraying the Egyptian people. It's the duty of the Egyptians to annihilate the Jews, to destroy their property. Egypt can never forget that it is the Jews who are carrying out Britain's imperialist policy in the Arab countries, and that they are the source of all the disasters which have befallen the countries of the East. The Jews aim at extending the domination throughout the Arab countries, but their future depends on a British victory. That is why they are trying to save Britain from her fate, and why Britain is arming them to kill the Arabs and save the British Empire. You must kill the Jews before they open fire on you. Kill the Jews who have appropriated your wealth and who are plotting against your security. Arabs of Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, what are you waiting for? The Jews are planning to violate your women, to kill your children, and to destroy you. According to the Muslim religion, the defense of your life is a duty, which can only be fulfilled by annihilating the Jews. This is your best opportunity to get rid of this dirty race, which has usurped your rights and brought misfortune and destruction on your countries. Kill the Jews, burn their property, destroy their stores, annihilate these base supporters of British imperialism. Your sole hope of salvation lies in annihilating the Jews before they annihilate you. The Nazi propaganda narrative in Europe was a narrative of projection and paranoia. It was a criminal narrative, and as all criminals who commit murder, or many of them who commit murder, say, I did it in self-defense. Here, applied to the Arab and Muslim context, was the same logic of projection and paranoia that was a defining feature of Nazism's radical anti-Semitism. It was impossible to be more blunt than this. It combined the political accusations of Nazism with evocation of the religious demands of Islam. A statement such as this was unusual only in the extent to which it voiced the genocidal threats that were more implicit in many other assertions about the venality and power of the Jews that were broadcast on Nazism's Arabic language radio. A younger generation of German historians have been doing superb work, and two of them in particular, Michael Malman, actually who's my age, and Martin Coopers, who's younger, have published an important book last year, Hauptmann und Hakenkreuz, Crescent and Swastika. This is about Nazi Germany's policies in the Middle East. And what they found was that German intelligence agents were reporting back to Berlin that if Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was victorious and was able to defeat the British Army and enter Cairo and cross the Suez Canal into Palestine, it could count on support from some elements of the Egyptian officer corps as well as from the Muslim Brotherhood. They also discovered, Baumann and Coopers, that an Einsatzgruppe, an SS division, was waiting in Italy and was prepared to depart to Palestine to murder the Jewish population there, had Rommel been successful at Al Alamein. German officials expected as much support for that endeavor as their Einsatzgruppen, as much support for that endeavor from the local Arab population as they had received from the Ukrainians when the SS units on the Eastern Front engaged in mass murder there. Suffice it to say, there remains much research to be done on the reception of Nazi broadcasts in wartime Cairo and the Middle East. Tantalizing hints of fifth column activity by the Muslim Brotherhood, by students at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, by the Young Egypt Organization, and some parts of the officer corps are to be found in the regular reports sent to London and Washington by British and American intelligence agents and diplomats. The immediate post-war months and years produced further evidence regarding the enthusiastic reception of the Grand Mufti's message in the Muslim Brotherhood. In the summer of 1945, Husseini fled from Germany but was arrested in France. And under circumstances that have never been fully or adequately explained, he escaped from French custody and arrived in Cairo. Marshal Tito's government in Yugoslavia wanted to put him on trial for war crimes for his role in inspiring and organizing an SS division of Bosnian Muslims during the war. The Allies were fully aware of his anti-Semitic incitement on wartime radio. An Office of Strategic Services report of January 23rd of 1945, the OSS report, on the Near East and the war crimes problem addressed the question of to what extent there would be support in the Arab world for Nuremberg-type trials of Nazi figures who had been accused of war crimes. The authors wrote that in the Near East, the popular attitude toward the trial of Nazi war criminals is one of apathy. As a result of the general Near Eastern feeling of hostility to the imperialism of certain Allied powers, there is a tendency to sympathize with, rather than condemn, those who have aided the Axis. Husseini arrived in Cairo in June of 1946. On June 11th, Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, sent a statement to officials of the Arab League, which American officials translated and sent back to Washington. It is said that al-Sayyid Amin al-Husseini has left France and arrived in an Arab country. Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, and all Arabs request the Arab League, on which Arab hopes are pinned, to declare that the Mufti is welcome to stay in any Arab country he may choose. That great welcome should be extended to him wherever he goes, as a sign of appreciation for his great services for the glory of Islam and the Arabs. The hearts of the Arabs palpitated with joy at hearing that the Mufti has succeeded in reaching an Arab country. The news sounded like thunder to the ears of some American, British, and Jewish tyrants. The lion is at last free, and he will roam the Arabian jungle to clear it of the wolves. What a hero! What a miracle of a man! We wish to know what the Arab youth, cabinet ministers, rich men, and princes of Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Tunis, Morocco, and Tripoli are going to do to be worthy of this hero. Yes, this hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. Writing the history of radical Islam is beyond my competence. And one of the purposes of this book is to provoke and stimulate young historians in Israel and in the Arab world who read Arabic to fill in the other side of this story, which is a very important aspect of the historiography of the 20th century. So writing the history of radical Islam, I've concluded, must entail the history of the interaction of fascist Italy, Vichy France, and above all Nazi Germany with the Muslim fundamentalists and the radical Arab nationalists of the wartime years. There is much work to be done on the intellectual, political, and cultural atmosphere of wartime and post-war Cairo. For I think it's plausible that it was then and there, and in wartime Berlin, that one important chapter in the history of radical Islam was written. As many of you know, Said Qutb was one of the preeminent intellectual figures of radical Islam in Egypt in the 1950s and 60s, and he was a key inspiration to the founders of Al-Qaeda. That too. In 1950, he published an essay called Our Struggle with the Jews. Most of it is a very close reading of the Quran with reflections on recent history. Ronald Nettler translates a section of the text as follows. And the Jews did indeed return to evil doing. So Allah gave to the Muslims power over them. The Muslims then expelled them from the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. Then the Jews again returned to evil doing, and consequently Allah sent against them others of his servants, until the modern period. Then Allah brought Hitler to rule over them. And once again today the Jews have returned to evil doing in the form of Israel, which made the Arabs, the owners of the land, taste of sorrow and woe. And so let Allah bring down upon the Jews people who will mete out the worst kind of punishment. I'm a historian of Europe and Germany, and it's not my place to engage in Quran exegesis. But we all know that Qutb here introduced an idea that could not possibly derive from reading the Holy Book, namely that Hitler was sent by Allah to rule the Jews. There is a parallel between Muhammad's struggle with the Jews and that of Hitler. Yet a parallel between Muhammad's struggle with the Jews and Hitler's struggles with the Jews, his attack on the Jews, was a theme that was broached often in the Nazi broadcasts. We don't know if Qutb was listening. But we do know that he knew Al-Banna and he was in the Muslim Brotherhood. There is much work to be done to connect European cultural diffusion to its reception in Cairo and elsewhere in the Middle East. There is much evidence now to suggest that the diffusion of Nazi ideology to the Middle East during the war was, as I said, one important chapter in the history of radical Islam that reached full bloom only many decades later. I have like 5 minutes more? Yeah. 6 decades and many wars in the Middle East separate us from wartime Cairo and Berlin. And as a historian, I raise a note of caution that the evidence and the events of 60 years ago are not an immediate explanation of what is happening in our own time. But I think it's a plausible hypothesis that a confluence of Nazi anti-Semitism and Muslim fundamentalism did take place during the war, due to a mixture of ideological affinities and shared political interests, and that this conjuncture was evident in the ideas and actions of the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots. Though Nazi Germany failed in its military and propaganda offensives in the Middle East, the ideas that it conveyed to the Arabs and the Muslims found adherents whose successors continued to shape contemporary events, from Said Qutb to the Hamas Covenant of 1988, and the recent statements of the President of Iran. Radical Islamists repeat conspiracy theories about powerful Jews and murderous threats about what to do about them that echo the themes of Nazi ideology and Europe's 20th century. In both Europe and the Middle East, radical anti-Semitism was connected to an interpretation of the Second World War as a war fought and won by international Jewry. Defeated and discredited in Europe, radical anti-Semitism struck a nerve in the post-war Arab and Muslim Middle East. How broad that echo was remains to be examined. It did so, it struck that nerve before the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. During World War II, as I noted earlier, anti-Semites viewed the anti-Hitler coalition as a key piece of evidence that international Jewry was dominating contemporary history. After the war, the founding of Israel was the same crucial piece of evidence for anti-Semites in the Arab and Muslim world. How could this have happened? How could the Jews who, according to traditional Islam, should be in a subordinate position, how could the Jews possibly have established a state? And how could this state possibly have survived? And the answer was that this little bitty state here was supported by a vast international Jewish conspiracy that dominated the world. The modes of interaction and the reception of European anti-Semitism in Muslim societies, both Arab and Persian, remains to be examined. This conjuncture was not a clash of civilizations, but a meeting of the minds. A link forged between two distinct traditions of antipathy to the Jews. I think it's safe to say that just as the history of Nazism is not or is no longer a strictly Eurocentric story, so the history of radical Islam has an important European component. Discredited in mainstream Europe, the melange of European and Nazi components of anti-Semitism merged with militant Islam, and this contributed to a second life in the Middle East. The longest hatred continued in a new language, in a new context, but with great vigor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for such a lucid and comprehensive and well-constructed presentation, which I'm sure is going to raise a lot of questions, and we have quite a lot of time. I would just like, if I may, to make a couple of comments, which are kind of addenda, which lead me to one question. The first thought that crossed my mind is when you mentioned that many Muslims in the Middle East regarded Hitler as a kind of perhaps God ordained or divinely ordained savior who had been sent for their liberation. I also have found many indications to suggest just how widespread this belief was, despite its essentially blasphemous character, if one were to look at it from a strictly Islamic viewpoint. And one can find it from Iran, which of course is a special case because they've been a cult and a large degree of collaboration with Nazi Germany even in the 30s under Reza Shah, in spite of the fact that he was not anti-Semitic. And you can find it in the Maghreb, and you find it in Egypt and in Palestine and many other places. There were proverbs. There was an Arabic proverb in Damascus during the war, which went something like, there is Mr. Hitler on earth and there is Allah in heaven, and the two go together. In the last issue of Der Spiegel, you might be interested in this, there was a piece about a famous German publisher in the post-war period called Ernst Rowohlt. And Rowohlt, it turns out, was very actively involved in this propaganda, German propaganda to the Muslim world during World War II. And he, in fact, was one of the key people who wrote some of this propaganda. I mentioned the Caucasus before, and one of the favorite slogans there, in German it went, but it was translated also into the Middle East in Arabic, was Allah über uns, Hitler mit uns. Allah over us and Hitler with us. One can hardly, I think, underestimate the popularity of these kind of slogans, and yet, as you say, and you were suggesting towards the end, with regard to the Muslim Brotherhood, there are more than echoes. There seems to be quite a significant mobilization in the direction of Nazism, and many links that haven't yet been fully made. But I would, on the other side, and this leads me really to the point that intrigued me the most, because you yourself brought it up, Arab nationalism, that there was this discussion among the Germans themselves. You know, do we appeal more to Arab nationalism or pan-Arabism against the British and the Jews and also the communists, or do we appeal to Islam? And we know, it's a well-known fact, it's been established for a long time, that Arab nationalists, whether they were in Syria, in Iraq, or Egypt and the Maghreb, many of them were only waiting for Rommel's victory in the case of North Africa, Nasser and Sadat, for instance. I mean, they openly admitted it many years later, how much they wanted a German victory at El Alamein. And, you know, Sadat was even a Hitler groupie for quite a long time, which is ironic in the light of what happened later. And Nasser introduced, as you know, the German propaganda experts into Egypt in the 1950s to take over Jewish policy. Mm-hmm. And Johannes von Leers is one of the great examples of someone active in the 30s, talking about Islam and National Socialism and all the themes that you've enunciated, and then reappearing in the 1950s together with Amin in Cairo, and they're continuing the work, this time directed against Israel, but as the center of the world Jewish conspiracy. You know, so much of the propaganda, the examples you gave, and I know you've got many more, suggest an actual identity, a near identity in emerging, and yet they come from two different cultures, different set of premises. And the most intriguing is that both Islam and Arab nationalism, in the context of a sort of broad Arab liberation movement, where the Jews are in the front line as both symbol and as immediate enemy because of Palestine, that they not only take on board this Nazi propaganda, they and I think that was the point that you were driving towards, that because they had these Arabic language speakers coming over Berlin radio, that they were successfully, for the first time ever, Islamicizing and Arabizing the Nazi form of anti-Semitism, something that had never been done before. You know, that idiom was there. And therefore I think it's a fairly stunning convergence, and definitely one that to me anyway helps to illuminate many things that have happened since, through the 50s right until the present. I don't know if you want to respond to that, or
very briefly, because I think people want. I'm sure there are many questions. I'm just the Germans were not stupid, and they did have an understanding of what would be perceived as sacrilegious and absurd. That is, they had some discussions. Could we present Hitler as the Mahdi, as the prophet who returns in Shiite religiosity? So, no, well, this would just appear to be too absurd. But the slogan "Hitler mit uns," Hitler with us, but Allah über uns, indicates that Hitler is in his proper place. He's merely another mortal. He's not replacing Allah. Everything depended on the outcome of the battles. I think that is my image of the Middle East is of a group of societies in the 1930s and 40s that are 80% illiterate, have a very small number of people who are politically engaged, who follow these things, and that a lot of it had to do with following the victor, following the winner. The Battle of El Alamein looms much larger in my eyes now as a moment in the history of the Jews in the Middle East than it did before I began this book. That the issue would have been destroyed, possibly, if that battle had been lost. I think one last point. There's something called a phrase I'll sort of coining it, racist multiculturalism. That this is what the Nazis were articulating in 1936. We're not better than the Arabs. We're just different. And everybody who's different should have their own little thing, and they should stick to themselves. And they should. So when Arab students came to Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s, and they had German girlfriends, they got in big trouble. And so the Foreign Office would call Husseini or Kilani and say, listen, there's this kid at the University of Leipzig, and he has a German girlfriend. Das geht nicht. This is verboten. This is, no, you've got to talk to the kid. All right, I'll talk to him, then they said, what are we going to do? We'll deport him. They said, we can't deport him, because if we send him to Switzerland, then he'll be a spy for the British and the Americans. So they were very, when it came time to actual relations between Arab men and women and German men and women and sex and romance and all that, then the Nazi sex police acted in a completely traditional, conventional, racist manner, and all this talk about how the Arabs were just like, equal to us, that went out the window. But unfortunately, the Nazi office, I forget the official title, that dealt with the Rassenpolitisches Amt. The files of the Rassenpolitisches Amt were bombed, and all of these marvelous stories about romance between the races were lost to history. A few of them survived in the Foreign Office files. But I think you've all been very patient. So you want me to call on people? You want to call on people?
No,
okay. Yes, I interrupted you earlier, so now you get to speak first.
Where did this conspiracy theory come from that seems to forerun the whole Nazi movement as you're describing it? And why did it spread so quickly? And who was responsible for that whole theory of Jews against the Germans and therefore self-defense from?
Well, you have Professor Wistrich, who's here at Harvard University, who's written a great deal about this. It has roots in famous texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and where does it have roots? Conspiratorial thinking appears in various aspects of the European political spectrum. Francois Furet has interpreted the Jacobins as advocates of conspiracy theories, but it's been ultimately. Correct me if you have a different view. I have always thought that it has a great deal to do with the Christian story of the death of Jesus. That if the Jews were powerful enough to murder the Son of God, they must be unbelievably powerful. And so in a way, a modern conspiracy theory is a secularization of an older religious tale. But there are many, many books about that, some of them written by Professor Wistrich. So that's, I think, enough on that thing. Yes, I'll start over here and then go this. Yes.
Two short comments and one question. First of all, I'm very happy that you mentioned Hassan al-Banna and Said Qutb, which are extremely important. And a lot of the motives you talked about can also be found in milestones and Malam Fitari, which is major. But let's not forget the third and fourth generation of the Brotherhood, Abdallah Salam Faraj, the guy who recruited the Silva killed Sadat, and of course Abdallah Yusuf Azam, the ideological mentor of Osama bin Laden, and especially the fatwa of 1984 in defense of Muslim lands and join the caravans. You'll find the same motives over there. The second thing is that alongside propaganda training, several Palestinian commanders who fought here during the 1948 war were trained by the SS in SS camps. One of the most known examples, of course, is the Abdul Qadir Husseini's demolition officer who blew up a Palestine post, and the Jewish agency in King George, Keren Yesod, was trained in an SS camp in Holland. And it was a combination of combat engineering and demolition and, of course, ideology. He was not there are about 10 of them. Now, the question I wanted to ask you is, by any chance, did you bump into any direct dispatches by Hassan al-Banna with Division 7? I'm not talking about Husseini and Kilani. I'm talking about Hassan al-Banna himself as the head of the Brotherhood. Is there any direct correspondence or connection with Berlin? And also including al-Mududi in India, who, by the way, was in correspondence with al-Banna.
The files of the German embassy in Cairo were destroyed after the war. So if there is correspondence between or contact between al-Banna and the German intelligence services in the Middle East, I haven't seen it. And that's why I really hope that there are Egyptian historians or Israeli historians who read Arabic who will be able to get in archives in Cairo. The Egyptian government suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood in 1948. And when it did so, it seized its files. So presumably, those files are somewhere in an archive in Cairo. Now, the problem of scholarship is inseparable from human rights and freedom, because to examine these very controversial questions in Cairo can be apparently life-threatening and dangerous for scholars to do. So we can't really tell the full story of this until the archives in the Arab countries are opened up. The American archives have an enormous amount, but it's not a substitute for looking at the original sources. Yes?
Briefly, 2 points. Does the Nazism at all, in terms of propaganda, utilize the Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916 as another instance in why the Versailles was also
Yes. Yes.
And secondly, I wanted to ask very briefly, were the Templars here in Jerusalem at all involved in any propaganda efforts?
You have to educate me. Who are the Templars in Jerusalem?
We actually have somebody writing on this for us. The Sassoon Center. The answer is yes, but how far we'll know, I hope, in a couple of years.
Let me just raise a cautionary note here. It's the interaction of these traditions that I want to understand. It is conceivable to me that radical Islam would have emerged without the impact of Nazism and fascism. I can imagine it. And so could Meyer Litvak, who's one of the finest scholars of Islam I think, in Israel. It remains an open question to me. I wouldn't want to say that Islamic radicalism is solely the result of European or Nazi or Italian fascist impact. It remains an open question, but it can't. I think the strongest thing I would say was that these things can no longer be left out of the equation. Yes.
Do you see any parallels between the Nazi-type conspiracy, Jewish conspiracy theory, existing anywhere in the Western world today?
In the Western world?
I said the Western, yes.
Oh, well, if you speak that way in Europe, Japan, Europe and the United States, it's a difficult question. I have to be careful. Yes and no, in the sense that if you speak in these crude terms like Ahmadinejad, then in Europe and the United States, everybody understands that you are some kind of a lunatic and a neo-Nazi, and that's the end of you politically. So in that sense, no, that tradition is dead and gone. If you say that Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl are responsible for the war in Iraq, and that the Israel lobby is responsible for 4,000 dead young people and 20,000 young people who have lost a limb in Iraq and $1 trillion, then you get $750,000 from a New York publisher and your book becomes a bestseller. So it has echoes. It has echoes of the old time stuff. It's somewhat more subtle, and it is disturbing. So
I think it's like the difference between soft porn and hardcore pornography, But
well, that's the way you put it.
I noticed your reluctance to actually I personally see very clearly that Mearsheimer and Walt and others of that nature with the neocons had some very serious and concerning intellectual and academic strides in that direction.
Well, Andrei Markovits and I wrote a letter to the London Review of Books, which you can read on the web in response to Walt and Mearsheimer. And we did say, I've known John Mearsheimer for 25 years. And I wrote that the question of whether they are personally anti-Semitic is not interesting or important. The issue is what is the nature of the argument. And that the book has made essentially an anti-Semitic argument, and a dangerous argument, because the war in Iraq was going very badly. And there were the weapons weren't there, and the plans were bad, and it didn't turn out the way it was supposed to, and that made those arguments more acceptable in some currents of American politics. You can't run for president and say things like that, but that's one. And the other side is what people don't want to talk about. In politics, there's what people talk about, and then what they don't want to talk about. And what they don't want to talk about is what I spoke about this evening. So if you talk about, if you speak the way I spoke this evening, then people say, aha, that's a neocon, right? You're talking about radical Islam. That's Islamophobia. You can't do that. That's nasty. So there's cause for concern, but not panic. You've been very patient. Yeah.
You mentioned a major turning point in the propaganda incidents with Husseini and other
Yes.
Muslims in Berlin. My question is, did that change come, the more virulent anti-Semitism and appeal to radical Islam in the broadcast, did that come because Husseini and others told them, look, this message isn't resonating enough, you need more Islamic appeal, and the Germans understood that, or because these Muslims told them, you have to speak in terms of Quranic language against the Jews?
That's a good question. When Hitler and Husseini met, I don't think Hitler was enormously impressed that he found someone else who was as radical and anti-Semite as he was, I have to think about your question. I don't have a good answer to it. It's obvious the Nazis didn't need somebody to encourage them to be anti-Semitic, but with Husseini, and Husseini more than Kilani, because Husseini was more of a religious. Husseini was important in integrating Islam and politics. That was more his concern than Kilani. Kilani was a more secular figure. I think in that sense, Husseini made a contribution. I'm going to think about your question, because it's a very good question. In which way did the causal arrows go, and to what extent did Husseini teach the Germans, as well as that's an important question. I have to think about it. Professor Bauer, yes.
Every Israeli knows that everything is divided into three.
I thought the French knew that.
So I have three points. I very much appreciate your attempt to see Nazi propaganda in terms of the development of the war. And I wonder whether you will collate that, Nazi propaganda to the Middle East with Nazi propaganda to the Caucasus in terms of the overall strategy, military strategy in early 1942 to sort of get the Middle East in pincer movements from the Caucasus and from North Africa. And this might sort of illuminate both the propaganda to the Middle East and again the impact of military movements. I think that this might be very important. My second point is in a much broader context, whether you have examined or will examine a comparison between National Socialism and its anti-Jewish policies, but also its general outlook with Soviet Bolshevism and radical Islam, because there seem to be parallels there. I wrote an article about that as a sort of a tryout in German in order to find people who will attack me and sort of correct me. Nobody replied.
They're too polite. Yeah.
So maybe you can do that. In other words, see whether there's any truth in such a comparison. Of course, there are great differences, but there are certain parallels. And my last point is, I know you differentiate quite clearly between Islam and radical Islam, because obviously the major attack internally, politically in Germany, where the Nazis came to power, was against social democracy and so on. The main attack of Bolshevism was against Russian social democracy, and the main attack, immediate attack of radical Islam against non-radical Muslims.
Yes.
And again, I wonder whether the Nazi propaganda there has a place in it. There's a certain context with it. But of course, I realized that the Nazis were sending this group of 17 SS-men to Athens under Rauf in order to murder the Jews of Palestine. There's a public argument about it, but there's no doubt that Malman and Kippers are right, that there was a definite plan, a very clear plan, in fact an explicit plan, to murder all the Jews everywhere in the world, and of course certainly in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot to address. The last point that Yehuda Bauer made is something that's very important to reflect on, and it's not one that we historians have talked about a great deal in years past. And if you wouldn't mind, he pointed out to me that at the Wannsee conference, there was a reference to 700,000 French Jews, but there were only 300,000 Jews in France at the time. So the other 400,000 were in North Africa. And these international dimensions of the final solution of the Jewish question have really not loomed large in the literature on the history of the Holocaust. So that may be one other aspect of some of this recent research. I think that for scholarly and stylistic and probably diplomatic purposes, I will keep referring to what I will call radical Islam or militant Islam or fundamentalist Islam, and certainly not Islam, because there are millions and millions of Muslims who don't accept this view. That said, the Nazis made the argument that their interpretation of Islam was based very well on the Quran and its commentaries, and that there was a great deal of evidence, of textual evidence, to support this interpretation of Islam. That it didn't do violation to the text. And I think that's one reason that the Islamists in recent decades do as well as they do, because they know the texts very well, and they seem to win the battle of the books in many instances. There is a classic work on the Third Reich and the Arab East by a Polish historian named Lucas Hersowitz, published in 1966, which is an excellent discussion, and I think it's still very good, of the connection between the war in the Balkans, the war in Iraq, the war in North Africa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He does a wonderful job of integrating the military, political dimensions of the war. One aspect of Nazi anti-Semitism that I pointed out in The Jewish Enemy, and that is clear here also, is that it was simultaneously a weapon of war, that is, an instrument and a tool in order to help win the war. That's why they kept associating Churchill and the Jews, Roosevelt and the Jews, not because it was partly because they thought it was true, but also because they wanted the American public to believe that the Second World War was a Jewish war. So when the Presbyterian family in Ames, Iowa, was sending their young man off to war, the hope that the Nazi hope was that they would believe that he was going to Europe to save the Jews. That's what they hoped. They wanted to make the war about that, and in so doing, try to undermine support for the war in the United States. But it was an instrument, and in the Middle East, they were hoping to use it as an instrument to undermine the power of Britain and the United States and to encourage an Arab revolt. But finally, I would say this. In the context of the Second World War, Nazi propaganda in the Middle East was unbelievably inexpensive. It was, a moderate investment in a few shortwave radio stations and transmitters, several hundred people, hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks. Not a big deal in the context of this enormous world war going on. If it worked, fine. Why not try? If it didn't, maybe you could plant some seeds of something. But nothing lost, nothing gained. And I was also struck in reading the files by how unromantic German diplomats were about the Arabs. They had very few illusions that there was a mass movement out there in their favor. They thought that there were people who were listening, but they knew, as did the British and the Americans, that everything depended on the outcome of the battles. Yes?
We just have time really for one. Okay.
You've said that the Nazis believed that the Jews wanted to exterminate the Germans.
Yeah.
But is it possible that Hitler and the Nazis created the myth of a Jewish desire to annihilate the German people, in order to make their own intention to annihilate the Jews more acceptable, even desirable?
Yes, both are true. Right. I mean,
they really believe that that's what the Jews Jews wanted.
I'm not a psychoanalyst, you know. I don't, you know, people say, here's, this will be brief. People say, did they really believe it? In politics, if someone gets up in public and says something again and again and again, after a while, it doesn't make any difference if they really believe it, because that becomes the political reality. Now, before Hitler took a gun and blew his brains out, he said it again and again at the very end, in the bunker in Berlin. And yet, one historian after another will say, well, Hitler said it, but he surely couldn't have meant it. But the past is a foreign country, you know, and people are strange. They believe all kinds of strange things. Just because we don't believe them doesn't mean they don't. Just one last question.
Two short questions. Usually Hitler in 39-40, when he met foreign leaders, discussed the Jewish problems, many of the smaller countries.
Mm-hmm.
There was one meeting, I think, I don't remember this moment, in the late 39. It is documented on Obersalzberg, and this shows there. Was it in Iraq or in Saudi? Major statesman of one of these states, there was a personal discussion with Adolf Hitler. Perhaps there is some documentation about that. It was late in 39, and it is documented on Obersalzberg in this show which was prepared by the Institut für Zeitgeschichte together with others. One short question, another very short question. Was anything of this, what you mentioned, of the German propaganda concerning the Middle East, the Arabs, Islam, etc., was anything also reflected in the anti-Jewish German propaganda in Germany during the war years? Or was this only a matter for the Middle East or for Arabs, or nothing for the Germans?
All right, I'm going to give a very brief answer to the second question. The Nazis funded an institute in Berlin for the study of Islam, Islamic Studies Institute. And Husseini gave the opening address when it was opened. And he was featured on the radio, the front pages of the newspapers. Husseini was a public figure in Germany, and the regime gave him a great deal of press. And so and during the North Africa campaigns, you know, that was a theme as well. So this was there were articles in the German press about the virtues of the Arabs and how the Nazis were arriving there to liberate the Arabs.
That was only in connection with Hussein.
Well, also with Rashid al-Khilani. You know, a part of the part of what the Nazi regime could do for them was to present them as important political figures within Germany. So they gave them a great deal of press and a great deal of publicity. This is Rashid al-Khilani, the premier of Iraq. He is an important man, and there would be articles about this in the Völkische Beobachter. When Husseini met Hitler or Ribbentrop, there were photographs taken, and it was, you know, there was nothing secret about it.
Just on that, I would add one point, because it relates to a very important question that was asked earlier. When you read closely the text of the famous meeting on 28th of November 1941 between Hitler and Husseini, if you read it without any preconceptions, I think that the impression you get is that Husseini was more radical, that his demands were in fact so extreme that Hitler was the cautious one who said, let's wait till we destroy the so-called Judeo-Communist empire in Europe, then the hour of liberation will come. Husseini was pressing him all the time. Their ideology sounds as if it was almost identical in that meeting. And Hitler's the one who has to promise him, yes, but I won't forget, the one thing we'll do in the Middle East is to make sure that all the Jews in the British sphere of influence, that's the term that's used, which includes much more than Palestine, it includes Iraq, includes Transjordan, includes Egypt, and so on, we will destroy. And the rest you will be free to deal with. but you feel that it's Husseini who's leading him.
Mm-hmm.
And when you examine the other statements, and I'm sure, you have ones that other people haven't seen, the radicalism is astounding. I mean, it doesn't fall short of anything that you can find from Himmler or Hitler or Goebbels and so on. So that I think the question of who is leading whom is apropos, There really is an interaction here. It's not a simple case of the Nazis setting a sort of ultra-radical tone and then an Arab nationalist fundamentalist leader following.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost... Sometimes you read these documents and the Nazis say, oh my goodness, there's another tradition out there that we weren't aware of. We weren't fully aware that we are not the only ones. We're not the only sources of anti-Semitism in the modern world. It comes from other places as well. We didn't create it. We didn't inspire this. It comes from different sources. We have nothing to do with them. But it's there, and now they can be allies. So...
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jeffrey also for his remarkable patience and ability to answer so many varied questions, and that added an extra dimension to your excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question.